Welcome to the introductory seminar on the Epistles of St. Paul, or Paul, if you will. An epistle. What is an epistle? There are letters and there are epistles. Some people call it the letter of Paul and the book of Paul and the epistle of Paul. A letter would be something that I wrote to you and I didn't want anybody else to read it. An epistle would be something that I wrote to you that I wanted you to share with other people, a family, or in this case, a congregation, and so forth. Now, there are a few letters that are addressed to certain people, Timothy and Titus. I suppose you could argue and say that those were letters because they were to certain people, but I believe they were meant to be read, so they're also part of the epistles of Paul. Paul, we won't really get into the first book that he wrote until 18 years after his conversion. When he was in Corinth, he wrote to 1 Thessalonians, and we're going to be going through these video seminars chronologically using a book called A Harmony of the Life of St. Paul by Frank J. Goodwin, Baker House Publishing. I suppose people argue over a lot of things and the dates and so forth, but the important part is what the epistle says. But to give you a little background, Paul was a young man who grew up as a Pharisee. He was taught under the feet of Gamaliel, we're told, and he became very zealous for Judaism, sort of like the Hasidim today in Israel and certain places. And he was actually going out, eventually persecuting the Christians. First, he participated in the stoning of Stephen and held the cloaks of the people that were doing the stoning, and then he went out and arrested people and brought them to trial, the Christians, and then was sent up to Damascus to bring Christians back from Damascus. But on the way, he met Jesus and appeared to him, and Saul ended up going to Damascus in 37 A.D. The conversion was around 36 A.D. He stayed there for a while, but then he mentions that he went into Arabia around 38 A.D. And then being in Arabia for maybe a year or so, he came to Jerusalem to meet the disciples who were afraid of him because they knew that he was the one doing the persecuting, and that would have been around 39 A.D. That was his first trip to Jerusalem after his conversion. They sent him away, they being the disciples, and he left. He wasn't there very long. He went up to Tarsus, where he was born, I believe, and then in Syria and Cilicia. We'll go into a map here and show the different things, the different journeys of Paul. So he was in Syria and Cilicia for 39 to 43 A.D. And then he went to Antioch in Syria. He there met Barnabas in 44 A.D., and Barnabas was with him, and Barnabas and Paul went back to Jerusalem in 45 A.D., second time that Paul had appeared in Jerusalem, and they went and took some money for the saints in Jerusalem. Then they returned back to Antioch, and they took off for the first journey, called the first journey of Paul. It went all the way up through Syria, up into what is today called Turkey, and towards the middle to Pisidia, Iconium, or the areas, and to the cities of Lystra and Derbe. And that would have been around 45 or 47 A.D. They returned back to Antioch, and Syria and spent a couple of years there, 48 in AD, 49 AD. Then in 50 AD, with a sort of an uproar with the church in Antioch, Syria, over the questions of Judaizing, they went down to Jerusalem in 50 AD. And then back up, after they received the letter, back up to Syria, Antioch, 51. And there Paul and Barnabas separated over arguments about taking John Mark. Then Paul left for on his second journey, and this journey would take him all the way over as far as the eastern part of Greece. He took along Paul and Silvanus, also known as Silas, depends on what version of the Bible translation you read. And then when they got close to Greece, sort of close to Istanbul, which is Constantinople in those days, a place called Troas, Luke, the writer of the book of Acts, joined them. And then they went into Macedonia, into Philippi, where they were jailed, and the earthquake took place in the story of the Philippian jailer. They left Philippi and then went down sort of southeast to Thessalonica. And when they were in Thessalonica, Paul went and started preaching to the Jews in the synagogues, and they, out of envy, got angry and brought a Jason, one of the men of that synagogue, before the magistrates, accusing Paul of being against Caesar and so forth. And then Paul left Thessalonica, and an uproar went to Berea, which was again south east of Thessalonica, and he went down, worked his way down to Athens. And that would have been around 51, 52, someplace in there. And then when he was in Athens, of course, he went to the Areopagus and preached to the people of Athens. And all of this is in the book of Acts up into the 17th chapter. And at the 17th chapter of Acts, it begins with him being in Corinth, and Silas and Timothy rejoin him there. And in Corinth, Paul writes the epistle to the Thessalonians, and that's where we'll begin with the seminars in the 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. I hope you'll join us in these wonderful epistles of Paul, and until then, God bless.